operations policy revisions, and for Ms. Paul and Ms. Garrison to come on up.
Good afternoon. We're here to bring several operations policies forward. Most of them are in Chris's area. Then we have one that deals with our environmental department. So if you want to start.
Thank you, Mrs. Paul. The 6 planning-related policies that are a part of today's workshop fall into 2 different categories. The first is Policy 7.03, which governs the naming of district facilities and components of district facilities. The primary impetus for this is that we want to make changes that facilitate the fundraising efforts that the Education Foundation is embarking upon on our behalf. So we worked in partnership with the staff of the foundation to bring forward these recommended changes. And so, in a nutshell, the substantial changes to the policy are that we are adding a category called legacy naming rights, which would be a renaming based on a substantial contribution of an individual. And another change that is a substantial one relative to the existing policy is that now a building or a new school or an existing school could be named after a person who is living. And then in the policy, there's a distinction now made between the traditional naming policy for schools that you're familiar with, where there's a committee and 3 different names are brought forward to you. There's now a distinction for legacy naming rights, the process that's followed for that, versus the traditional committee naming process. Now, the policy continues to allow the school board to rescind naming rights for good reasons, but we have worked with the Office of General Counsel to enhance that language to give the board that ability, especially now that you might be naming schools after individuals who are still alive. And then finally in this policy, there's a new form that has been updated to reflect the legacy rights that have been added to the policy. The next 5 policies together represent the progression from our former school concurrency program to its successor, which is called School Capacity Availability Determination. We have been working to implement the interlocal agreement that established that process for a number of years now, and we're finally at the point where we feel comfortable that we can reflect that in policy. As you may recall, both chapters 163 in Florida statutes and chapter 1013, which pertains to educational facilities, require that school districts have an interlocal agreement that outlines coordinated planning efforts whereby the school district and local governments share information and coordinate their planning efforts. And the next policy, 7.131, coordinated planning, is where the bulk of that occurs in our school board policy. So we changed the references to concurrency and reflected the new SCAD procedures. That's our acronym. It's not the College of Design, but it's our local acronym. And also eliminates the former level of service provisions of school concurrency that are no longer in effect. And then moving on to the capital budget, likewise, we have changed the references to school concurrency and now reference SCAD, and we have added the new maximum cost per student station provisions in statute. And then the next 3 policies are simply repealed because they're either no longer applicable, or in the case of businesses near schools, we have incorporated those conditions and provisions into the coordinated planning policy where we thought they better belonged. And then with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mrs. Paul for the environmental policy.
And basically on this policy, with the advent of cost per student station, we no longer build our schools to LEED Silver certification. So that's the change in that policy.
At this point, we'll be happy to entertain any questions.
Any questions? Mrs. McQuinn, then Mr. Barbieri.
I may just not see it. When we use the term significant contribution, do we define significant? I know you've been anticipating that.
Thank you for asking me a very difficult question. I think it will depend on a case. It'll be on a case-by-case basis, and probably be discussed among leadership before we bring any recommendation forward to the board.
Mr. Shaw?
Mrs. Whitfield.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question that Ms. Paul just said about the LEED certification. Since we won't be able to continue having that LEED certification, is there any assurances that will still work to make the schools as environmentally productive as possible?
Yes, I think we will strive to try to stay as close as we can. But with, the cost per student station requirements, it kind of ties our hands on many things.
Thank you.
Mr. Barbieri.
On policy 7.03, naming of schools, paragraph D in section paragraph 3, it says if a school becomes a community school or ceases to become a community school after it's formally named, the procedures in this section are required to add community to the school's name. I would assume you want to put also that it's not required to delete the name, the word community from the school's name. But a more important question, I think, is why don't we just do away with using the word community? Because all of our schools, we attempt to make community friendly and have programs that encourage community participation. So, I mean, I've got schools in my district that one year they're community schools and the next year they're not, and the letterhead has to keep changing to move it back and forth. Either we add community to all of them or we take community away from all of them rather than going back and forth with changing the name every time a community school opens an evening program. So what are your thoughts on that, Ms. Garrison?
I'm looking at our deputy superintendent for guidance.
We can take that back and look at that, and for the first read, we'll take a look at and have a discussion internally.
Okay, thank you.
And I want to jump in on that one and say, Mr. Barbieri, I think that's an excellent idea, and it's probably been 20 years ago, this board had exactly the same discussion about whether or not it should be community or not community or included. So I think it is worth taking a look at. So any other comments? Mrs. McQuinn, I saw a reaction from you. You want to make any comments? Mr. Barbieri.
On the policy that deals with the SCAD report, Mrs. Garrison, would you just, since we've been through this over and over again in Boca Raton, can you just explain it in layman terms exactly how this is going to work? Do we have, so we're going to make a recommendation of mitigation, and then it's up to the local city council to decide whether they're going to implement it. So there's never going to be any discussions anymore in the newspaper about the school board approved the new development in the city of Boca Raton. So we're going to be beyond that, right?
You're correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So the new form does not say we recommend approval.
Correct. Yeah, this is an evolving process, and I can't promise you that it's done. We will always, based on new experiences, input we get from elected officials and other planning staff, we're going to always try to improve it. But you are correct. The form only recommends reasonable conditions to mitigate impacts on schools in the event the local government chooses to approve the application.
Okay, and a follow-up, Mr. Shaw?
Mr. Barbieri.
So when we look at the projections on what a community or new development is going to add to the school system, I know that there's a formula that's used, but, you know, can we put something in the policy that requires us to go back to the city or the other governmental entity after the community's built to actually document whether or not our projections were accurate so that we can modify the formula based on what we find? For example, if we have a new building being built in Boca Raton that's a condominium building that has 3 bedrooms, sometimes I don't know if we anticipate that a 3-bedroom condo in a place where there's no place for kids to play will generate the same number of students as we would get in a community where there's a 3-bedroom, single-family home. So I just want to make sure that the projections we're using, since it's constantly under fire in my district, that we're accurate on those and we have some kind of test that shows whether or not the formula is accurate.
I could respond to that in a couple of ways. One is that the multiplier, the student generation rate, or the student multiplier that you're referring to that we use, is based on the multiplier that was developed by the Palm Beach County Impact Fee Consultant. They did a very extensive study of all of the residential housing units countywide. Now, is that going to be as accurate in West Boynton as it might be in a high-rise in West Palm Beach? You know, that it probably won't be, but it's accurate on a countywide level. What I would like to do when resources allow is to start to drill down at and look at ourselves, do our own studies, and look at what variables like the building height might play in either reducing or increasing the number of students generated. I also would like to look at regional rates. It's just we've been so focused, honestly, on the address verification efforts in Boca that hasn't made its way to the front of our workload priorities.
So
but it is definitely on my radar.
Okay, so I understand that, you know, the workload is immense, because I get it, because I know what's going on with trying to count the number of students at Boca High School. But I just am concerned that when we use this regional or this district-wide generation, that, you know, somebody's going to come forward at some point and say, what you projected on that development in District 5 is way, way off, and we didn't come up with that first. So I'd rather us tell the city council that, you know, our projections were off, and we're going to modify the formula, rather than finding out in the newspaper that we projected 2 students and there's actually 20. So I just want some kind of test, and so that we're the ones that find the errors and say we're correcting the formula, rather than somebody pointing out that the school district screwed this up, I mean, which is what they've been doing down there, is, you know, printing that kind of stuff. So can we just, you know,
We can
get
definitely
some...
look at that.
Thank you.
Mr. Shaw?
Mrs. Whitfield.
I would love to follow up on what Mr. Barbieri said, because we've had the same problem in Lake Worth. I think one thing that could be potentially helpful for cities is for them to understand what mitigating factors would need to take place in the event that an area, once developed, ends up with more children than they were expecting, or that it becomes very popular just for families in general. And how long that will take, because I think that's been one of the challenges we've had here, is that you know, the remedy is going to take some time, and the community is very concerned about that. So I don't know how that would work in this report, or if it's just a conversation with electeds that could take place, but something along those lines, so they understand truly what an approval means.
Okay, I think they got that. I need to make the comment that I do every time we talk about long-term planning and capacity. The one thing that's never included, and I know it's not something we have control of, is the issue of how the increased number of charter schools impacts our capacity. And right now, we're facing that in Boca Raton with the possibility of 2 additional charter schools. And I think that I would like, since we don't have a lot of control of how that and if that capacity is even considered, that we figure a way that we can communicate with cities so that when they're looking at applications for the site planning of charter schools, that we give our input and that they're aware of what that impact is, because it really is a big issue, and it may be one of those issues that we continue to look at legislatively to get some fix. So, any other questions, Dr. Robinson?
Not a question, but a comment on the naming of schools. I just am not in favor of bypassing the SAC just because somebody put a bunch of money on the table. And that's how I read it, that if a benefactor puts a lot of money on the table, essentially for what appears to be naming rights, then we would bypass the school advisory council. And I think that that's inappropriate. Unless I misread it.
Any other comments? Mr. Barbieri?
If that's the case, I agree with Dr. Robinson. I mean, the SAC should have the final recommendation to the superintendent.
All right, I think you got all those suggestions that we had tonight. So with that, if there are more questions, we'll close this part of the workshop, which concludes the workshop. So is there a motion to adjourn the workshop? Motion by Mrs. Andrews, second by Mrs. Brill. All in favor, all opposed, motion carries. And now we'll go to the special meeting. So